My friend and fellow author Blair Lynn remembers the moment the floor dropped out beneath her. What followed were panic attacks, ER visits, and waves of anxiety so intense they left her trembling, breathless, and afraid she might die. As a Christian, she knew she should cast her cares on God, but she didn't know how. In the depths of fear and discouragement, simple answers and spiritual cliches fell flat. There was no quick fix, no bypassing the valley. In Made to Tremble, Blair shares how she learned to walk with God through her anxiety, not around it. With scripture, story, and raw honesty, she shows what it means to embrace our weakness, not as failure, but as the place where God meets us most tenderly. This is a book for anyone who feels overwhelmed, afraid, or unsure if faith can hold in the storm. Through Blair's story, discover the peace of God and a deeper awe of the God of peace. Get your copy at madetotremble.com. The Sing hymnal, from award-winning hymn writers Keith and Kristen Getty, is a rich collection of classic and contemporary hymns created to deepen worship, foster unity in the church, and proclaim the hope that we have in Christ. Alongside beloved hymns, you'll also find psalms paired with songs, liturgical readings, and helpful indices, making this hymnal a lasting resource for families and congregations alike. Pick up your copy wherever books are sold, or get 30% off at crossway.org/Getty hymnal with a free Crossway Plus account. You are listening to the Confronting Christianity podcast, and I'm here with one of my dearest friends in all the world, Julie Ferrell. Very exciting. Julie, for those who do not know and love her like I do, is currently a stay-at-home mum. When I say currently, as in for the last 12 years since she had her first child, or 12 and a bit years, I think, since Lydia was born, she's been staying home with her daughters, Lydia Marie, Jane, and Charlotte, who go down in by twos. We sort of have two-step age ranges between Lydia's four girls, and she and her husband live in the greater Boston area. Her original undergrad degree at Duke University was a double major in religion and history with a minor in chemistry, which seems utterly overwhelming to my unpracticed ears, but gives you just a little bit of a sense of Julie's background and interests. And I have asked her to come and chat with me today about something we both care about a lot, which is motherhood. And I've warned her that I'm going to tell a little story that I find very funny, and I think she finds sort of slightly awkward. But here it is. So about a year ago, maybe a year and a half ago, I was doing a speaking event at the wonderful Jen Wilkins Church. Many of our listeners, I think, will be familiar with Jen Wilkins' work. If not, pop over to the Knowing Faith podcast or Google Jen Wilkin and read many of her books. But Jen is a master in the field of teaching the Bible to average people in the pews on Sundays on a whole range of topics. And the night before I had flown down to Texas to speak at Jen's church, my second born, who is a wonderful and delightful soul called Eliza, was having a moment about the fact that I was traveling. And she said to me that night, why can't you be like Julie? Julie, who is an outstanding mother in every way. And in particular at that time, Julie was not only staying home with her kids, but actually homeschooling her kids. And so Eliza was like, why can't you be like Julie and stay home with me all the time? And I relayed this to Jen before I spoke at her church. And Jen, who has also gone through the experience sort of traveling to speak and having to kind of juggle family commitments alongside that, she said, did you respond and say, Julie sucks? And I said, no, Julie's amazing. Frankly, I think everyone should wish that Julie was their mum. But I had to say to Eliza, listen, I know you've drawn the short straw and found I am your mother rather than Julie, and we're just going to have to kind of work with that. But I very much agree with Eliza that being your daughter would be one of the most fantastic experiences, Julie, and I appreciate you coming and chatting with me again about something that I think we both deeply care about and that we approach in many senses in very similar ways, but actually we work out our experience of motherhood or our kind of vocation, to use a sort of heavy Christian-y word, of motherhood in somewhat different ways. So I wanted to have a conversation with you just about the way that we think about motherhood. So Julie, do you want to, I'd love for people to just get a sense of how you have reflected on motherhood even since before you were a mother, because I know you've kind of had a strong sense of desiring at least to be a mother well before you were in fact a mother. So talk us through a little bit of that.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thanks for having me here. And for the record, I still really admire Jen Wilkin and I love her. So just so you guys know.
You don't think Jen sucks?
I don't think she sucks. I don't think she sucks at all. I think she's great and she's doing really good work. And I'm also thankful for the work that God has put in my life. So I grew up in a big family. I am the third of 6 children. My parents were both one of 7 children. I loved having a big family. And my mom did choose to stay at home with us to care for us. But we always knew that she probably could have done any number of things, career-wise, but that it was important to her that she stay home and raise her 6 kids. So I always sort of had that model of a really strong, capable woman who could make that choice where she felt like God was leading her. However, I had no idea if I would ever get married. I had no idea if I would ever become a mom. And so, it was important to me to pursue whatever I did with excellence as a steward of what God had given me. Yeah. So I went to college and I thought, like many other Duke students, that I wanted to go to medical school. So I pursued kind of the pre-med work, but I also loved the humanities classes that I was taking. So I loved to learn. I had grown up in a family where learning was a really high value. I did happen to meet Addison there, whom I would eventually marry. And I think towards the end of college, had to wrestle with some real questions related to, okay, if I am going to marry this guy and I want to eventually stay home with my kids, what is a wise investment of my time and money? Should I pursue postgraduate work? Or should I kind of take another path? I did end up deciding to not pursue graduate work. It became clear kind of over the years that we were hoping to get married. There's a lot more there, but long story short. And so I graduated from college. I got a job. We got married a bit after that. And a couple of years later had Lydia. And I have been home for the 12 years since. But I've always felt like that was a choice. That wasn't something that, I had to give up a different big dream. That was always something that I had really hoped to be able to do if the Lord permitted that. And that's how things happened.
I may be misquoting your youngest child, Charlotte, but I think it's close. When you were telling her, I think last year, about how you and Addison had met, and she said, "Did you go up to Daddy and say, would you like to marry me and have babies?" And you were like,
that's exactly
not exactly.
It did not work like that. It was several years of investing in an important relationship before making that leap.
So I think some people, certainly many, I think in our culture, have been raised to think actually one of two things. I'm gonna sort of explore the full range of things that people might have been raised with. On the one hand, I think there are some people and probably many people who've come from a Christian family and a sort of church background who have been raised with the idea that really the highest calling for any woman is to be a wife and a mother, and that the path that every sort of young woman or little girl has in her head is like, I'm going to, grow up, go to college, get married, have children and be a stay-at-home mum. And that's necessarily the plan A, and anything else is going to be plan C, D, E or F. At the other end of the spectrum, I guess, there are many people who would be raised with the idea that like, actually it's really limiting to women. It's in fact restrictive and burdensome to women to have babies at all, and that really what a woman should be first and foremost aspiring to is having a career. And women are going to need to recognize the fact that actually often having a baby is sort of inhibiting to one's career, and you sort of have to figure out ways around that. But in many people's minds, the sort of possibility of having children, especially for a woman, is one that seems more like a burden or a kind of encumbrance to the plan A than it is being the plan A itself. What would you say to people on, I guess, both ends of those spectrums? So maybe we'll start with the people who would say this is just an encumbrance, a burden, like plan A is to be highly successful, make as much money as possible, live my dream, and if children come along, then we're going to have to figure that out. What would you say to somebody who's sort of feeling that way?
It's going to turn your life upside down. I think there's no question that parenting does kind of turn a lot of what your day-to-day looks like, a lot of kind of what your professional aspirations or trajectories are. Not that those are things you have to give up, but all of a sudden, when you become a parent, you are entrusted to caring for this person. And so I do think that there's a sense of weight of responsibility of that. And yet, I think there's an illusion in our culture that we can kind of have it all as women. And I think we're always making choices to sacrifice something for something else. And so I don't think that we have to have kids, to the detriment of a career necessarily. But I also think we want to be wise and thoughtful about those choices, knowing that having kids certainly impacts what our day-to-day looks like, but also that it's a really kind of beautiful, helpful thing for us because we are limited creatures. We have limited capacities, and we kind of can't have it all no matter what. And then I think on the motherhood being the highest calling, this is probably more where I fell into that camp growing up. And I think one of the things that motherhood has taught me is that it is an extraordinarily high calling. Yes. But my highest calling is to be a disciple of Christ. And I don't ever want to get those mixed up, because the working out of my calling to be a faithful disciple of Christ can also look a lot of different ways in motherhood. So motherhood is not ultimate, actually. It's really important, but my being a mom doesn't actually define who I am. And so I think especially for people who aren't in a position where they're able to have children, or they're not married and they're not moms, I think this narrative can be really dangerous. And I think can lead many people to feel like, well, if I'm not a mom, then am I even valuable? And the answer, according to scripture, is resoundingly yes, that children are unanimously throughout scripture a blessing. And we want to care for them well, but we are not defined by our motherhood just as much as we are not defined by whether we are single or married.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really, really helpful point that I think often, especially kind of within Christian cultural settings, as people are discussing these questions, whether it's marriage and singleness, or whether it's a woman's highest goal to be a wife and a mother, etc., we can take something that is really good, like marriage, and say, kind of in order to emphasize how good marriage is, we need to denigrate singleness, when actually the Bible holds both of those things up as beautiful ways that a Christian can live and glorify God. And I think one of the things I've really appreciated in our friendship and in my friendship with a number of other kind of close friends of mine who are mothers and are arranging their lives differently is that actually I don't think there is a kind of one size fits all approach to what does it look like sort of day to day to mother. So for example, you as one of my closest friends and highly intelligent, capable, and generally fabulous woman choosing to stay home with your kids full time. I have another very close friend who I pray with every Thursday who works full time and her husband stays home with her kids. I work essentially part time, mostly while my kids are at school. There's sort of various ways in which the day to day can look. But I think you were mentioning this to me the other day, Julie, helpfully, that actually, regardless of our kind of work situation, our calling as mothers is actually essentially the same. So talk us through what you mean by that.
Yeah. So I think, again, if we had some kind of a silver bullet related to how to be a great mom, I think we would have done that. And I think actually there's beauty in the fact that there is not like a magic formula or a silver bullet to being a mom, that our day to day can look very different, whether we're at home or whether we are part-time working or full-time working or kind of anywhere in between. I think so much more of motherhood is about our posture towards God as Christian mothers, particularly entrusting our children to the sovereignty of God and knowing that He is capable of working out in our children what we cannot do ourselves. And so we want to be intentional and thoughtful and prayerful as moms about what is a wise way to spend our time, for example, or what do we do with our careers. But at the end of the day, I think more than anything, we want to be surrendered parents to entrust our kids to the Lord, to know that He loves them more than we do, that He knows them more intimately than we do, and that He is going to use kind of whatever our life circumstances are for the good of our children in a way that we might not know. We might feel really confident in our conviction about working or not working, or we might feel kind of uncertain, but still have to make a decision either way. I mean, I know for me, I've had seasons where I'm like, oh, I don't know. Should I be working? It probably would be helpful to my family. Or, there are things that I could be doing that probably would be good and fruitful. But I think just resting in the fact that this is where God has me and asking, what does it look like to be faithful today is a good question as a mom to be asking ourselves. How can I be faithful today?
Yeah.
That might change next year.
Yeah, that's super helpful. I think you and I were chatting the other day even about the decisions that we make about our kids educationally, and I know there's wild amounts of controversy in the sort of Christian conversations around schooling, because some people would say, listen, if you're a Christian parent and you are not homeschooling your kids, then there is something, profoundly wrong with what you're doing as a parent. And other people would say, definitely you should be sending your kids to Christian private schools to be educated, in the ways of the Lord and in kind of academic senses. And others who would sort of go the other way and say, actually, you should be sending your kids to public school, being part of the local community, that there are really kind of negative impacts on the broader culture if Christians just sort of retreat from public school environments, which for our listeners in England, public schools are not expensive swanky boarding schools as they are in England. But in America, public school means state school in England, just for a little cultural diversity there. And so it's been fun walking alongside you as both of us. So my 3 kids are all in public schools, and at least so far in their development, I think that's been a great decision for them. They have absolutely, especially my older girls who are in middle school, absolutely has had to sort of weather storms when it comes to being a Christian in the kind of Cambridge, Massachusetts public school system here, because there's actually a lot of ways in which their Christian ethics don't line up with what they're being taught at school or what their friends are experiencing. And I know I've walked with you through a season of having your kids in public school, and then when the pandemic started, a season of actually homeschooling your kids, which you continue to do beyond the end of when kids were kind of out of formal school environments, and then deciding that actually was the right thing to put your kids back in public school. So I'd love to just hear some of your thinking on that as you've made those, or as you and Addison have made those decisions kind of along the way.
Yeah, I mean, before our oldest went to kindergarten, I agonized over the school decision. And I think many parents, Christian and non-Christian parents, can relate to this, because you feel like so much hinges on where your child goes to kindergarten. And it's only in retrospect, I think, that I can maybe see that I sort of overemphasized the magnitude of that decision. But again, like as parents, we want to be wise and we want to be thoughtful, and we do have some measure of agency over what we decide, school situation we decide to put our kids in. So we decided to put our oldest in the public school. We had a lovely school that was just walking distance from our house. And we were like, you know what? We love our town. We want to give this a shot. And it wasn't perfect, but it was great. And we were like, oh, okay, maybe this could work. The other option had been homeschooling, just kind of for the record. So she was in the public school. Then the pandemic hit, and really we weren't planning on homeschooling. It wasn't until August of that year that the kind of hybrid school model was presented to the families. And at that time I had a 2, 4, 6, and 8-year-old. And I was like, oh, this is not going to work. I can't manage a first grader and a third grader on Zoom school while also taking care of a 2-year-old and a 4-year-old. And if I effectively have to homeschool my kids anyway, I think I'd rather do that on my own terms. So I kind of threw together some plans and submitted them to the district in about a week. But then, we found that homeschooling worked really well for us in that season. I loved our slow mornings. I loved spending a lot of time just kind of playing outside and being free to read for the afternoons. There were many sort of like magical elements to homeschooling. It was also incredibly hard. And I think in Christian homeschooling circles, sometimes people don't necessarily emphasize that in the way that I sort of needed it validated. Like, I am struggling here. This is really intense. And so then we just kind of made the decision that every year we would reassess and see if it worked, which we did reassess for a couple of years, and we decided to keep homeschooling. We loved the flexibility. We loved all the time together and the unique opportunities it presented. And then last summer, our oldest was heading into middle school and our youngest was heading into kindergarten. And we had been feeling the tension of living in our community, but not really feeling like we were fully a part of the community. We live in a small-ish town where most people do go to the public schools. And we'd always kind of felt that tension throughout the years of homeschooling. So this felt like a natural transition point for us. But I was terrified, frankly. I felt good about the decision, and I was simultaneously really afraid. It was the first time in over 11 years that I would have free time in the day without a kid by my side. And I think the Lord really used that fear to help me grow, because I felt more vulnerable as a parent, I think, than I had ever felt up to that point. Because as hard as parenting can be, I always had my kids close with me. And this year has been very fruitful. I'm so thankful. But yeah, no, I think I've really had to grow just in like my prayerfulness and also in my intentionality about how can I take some of the things that we really loved about being in homeschool and maybe apply them to our time together now. So we majorly limit our after school activities, as you know, so that we have time to get together with friends or to play outside. And again, I think regardless of what schooling situation people find themselves in, you're always having to make those choices about how to wisely spend your time and how to invest in your kids for their, hopefully, for their fruitfulness.
Yeah. It's sort of fun to hear you say that and to remember the ways in which you and I are made differently. For those listening in, Julia's far more naturally kind of tidy and organized than I am. For example, like I naturally live in squalor very happily, and Julie, I think pretty much every time I'm at your house, I kind of accidentally or my son accidentally kind of disorganizes something, and you just carefully clean it up and make sure it's back to ship shape. And likewise, I almost had the opposite experience. I mean, my eldest is soon to turn 14, and when I first had her, I took 3 months off from work as sort of maternity leave. And by the end of that period, I was definitely kind of feeling like I just sort of at an emotional level, I kind of wanted to be with my daughter, but I also wanted times when I wasn't with her and when I was working. And then, my second daughter, I think I took 2 months off. And then with my sweet son, who is now 5, I think I wrote the first article like 5 days after he was born, like the first sort of piece of work that I did, because I just had an urge to write an article about the experience of giving birth. And it was just, so we're wired in different ways, which is actually wonderful. I think it's so easy, probably regardless of what we believe about the universe. I think it's easy always for people to get into a kind of comparison game when it comes to motherhood, and when it comes, whether it's actually looking at people who are mothers and thinking, oh, well, I wish I was a mother, and maybe I wish I was a mother, or maybe if I was a mother, I'd be doing so much better than my friends who are mothers are doing. They sort of have that kind of critical piece, or to be in a situation where you do have children and you're kind of looking at your friends who have children and thinking, oh, well, clearly they are doing so much better or so much worse than I. It's sort of very easy for us, I think, to get into almost a competitive or a comparative mindset, which I only really do kind of jokingly, because I sort of know who I am, and my kids kind of have to muddle along with the mother that they have. But I love I love how even in your kind of trajectory as a mother, and I think both of us have been sort of figuring out year on year, like what is the best thing as far as we can discern for our children this year. And it may even be a different best thing for one child than for the other children. It's not necessarily a kind of one size fits all. There was a moment, for example, a couple of years ago when we considered whether we should shift our eldest daughter, who was in her first year at middle school, into a Christian school, actually, because she was experiencing a lot of really hard things from peers and the sort of school environment, to where it felt like, oh gosh, I think she may struggle to weather this storm. She actually did end up weathering the storm, quite well. So I feel like it was the right decision to have her stay there, but that it's absolutely a child by child, sort of year by year decision, at least for those of us who have the privilege of having that decision. I think it's important to recognize there are many faithful Christians across the US and across the world who actually really don't have the option of staying home with their kids, or maybe don't have the option of not staying home with their kids, depending on their cultural setting. But there are many, who are needing to work with every hour they have to support their families, and for whom, being able to put their kids in public school is absolutely a blessing, and not something that's a question mark for them. Kind of year on year, we're all going to be in different situations as we parent, if we are parenting. Julie, I'd love for you to give us just a flavor of what difference it makes in your approach to parenting that you are a follower of Jesus, and that is what you aspire for your kids to be, and certainly seems like what they are, as far as we can tell. But what difference does that make to you on a daily or weekly basis?
I think parents universally, kind of regardless of where they land faith-wise, want the best for their kids. I don't think there are many parents who aren't seeking to parent their kids really well. And for me, because as you mentioned, I'm a little bit neurotic. I'm a bit of a perfectionist.
I didn't say neurotic.
All right. Well, I am neurotic, so I'll freely admit that. And I think that for me, the temptation to control is so strong. And in my role as a stay-at-home mom, which I have loved, I've found it very easy to fall into a trap of like performance-based parenting. And I think this can be really dangerous because, again, as a Christian mom, my primary desire is for my kids to know the Lord, the same saving grace that I have experienced in Christ, how he has rescued me from my sin. I so badly want my kids to have that freedom and to take that in as their own. And so, because I fear, what if that doesn't happen? What if my kids don't come to faith? Again, I think the desire to control then is very strong. And so for me, I think where I really see God's kindness towards me as a Christian parent is just, he reminds me that I am not in control, that he loves my kids more than I do, that he created them and that he has purposes for them. And so, in the performance trap of parenting, there are sort of pitfalls on either side. I think one of the pitfalls can be, well, if I just do all the right things, then my kids are going to know Jesus. But actually, I can't save my own children. That is something that only God can do through the grace of Christ. So that's dangerous. And then I think the other side of that is any of my failures will mean that my kids won't know the Lord because I failed to be patient with them. And because I yelled at them, then all of a sudden, we're kind of toast. And I think what God has sort of kindly done for me is remind me that even in all of my failures, he can use those to point them to himself, and that he is sovereign over their lives. And I actually don't have to operate out of fear because he loves them and he cares for them. And so I actually instead get to enjoy partnering with him in this work. It's sort of astounding to me that in all of my weakness as a parent, God still chooses to use me to minister to my kids, which are really his kids that he loves. And so I think when we experience that freedom of not being in control, but also being able to partner with God in the good work of raising our children, we can find a lot of joy, and it doesn't feel quite as burdensome, even when it's really hard, because we know that we also are dependent on our Father who loves us and cares for us.
What do you do when it feels like your spiritual life is crumbling? When trusted leaders fail, doubts rise, grief hits, and you don't know what to believe in anymore? In her new book, Someone to Believe In, Embracing the Saviour Who Stays the Same When Everything Else Changes, author and Bible teacher Courtney Reisig helps us to see Jesus' unshakable character. If you're not sure whether you believe in Jesus yet, or if your faith feels unsteady in the face of grieving, burnout, or disillusionment, this book invites you to encounter Jesus as the one who is the same yesterday, today, and forever. Get your copy of Someone to Believe In today at someonetobelievin.com. I had a fun conversation with my eldest a few months ago where she was talking about the fact, a lot of her peers who are kind of going through adolescence and figuring out like who on earth they are. Like it's a hard stage of life to be at, as you've got hormones raging and you've got social dynamics changing and you've got so many pressures from the world in general, to figure out who you are, and to even, I think there's a strong kind of cultural narrative we have today that anyone can be anything. That if you only try hard enough and dream big enough, then you can surely be the next Taylor Swift or the next, whoever it is that is your person you would most aspire to be like. You can be rich and famous and successful, and maybe you're the next Nobel Prize winner, or maybe you're the next Olympic athlete. And that there's a lot of pressure actually on kids to, from an early stage, figure out who they are and what they're going to be, and whether that's in terms of some people will end up expressing that on like, oh, what is my sort of sexual identity or gender identity, or what is my sort of career aspiration. There are different ways in which this can manifest, but this deep desire for kids at a certain age to sort of have a sense of like, who am I? Who am I in this world? What am I about? And I remember my daughter Miranda saying how actually incredibly liberating it was for her, as she is surrounded by people who are trying to figure out their identity from the ground up, to at a profound level know who she is. She's like, I know that I am a child of God. I know that the purpose of my life is not actually to follow my dreams and to achieve my highest goals, but actually to be a follower of Jesus, to live under him, and that my future ultimately is guaranteed by Jesus and doesn't depend on where I go to college or who I have a relationship with or whatever. Like, it's just none of that is at the heart of who she is, and how just sort of liberating that was actually to not need to be in that place, and not to say, of course, as those of us who are Christians, in multiple ways we continue to struggle with our identity, and whether it's when we're 30 or when we're 43, sort of figuring out like, oh well, what will people think of me if I say that I'm a stay-at-home mum, or what will people think of me if I say that I work and I leave my kids at home, or what will people think of me if I am not yet married, or if I've been divorced, or what will people think of me if I fill in the gaps. It's not that isn't present for us, but that there is at least a baseline of knowledge of who on earth we are. And I think that's something that we can sort of shepherd our kids in, if we are Christians, to say, at the end of the day, who you are isn't going to depend on the grades you get, the university you go to, the social group you're in, how you express yourself in sort of various kind of cultural contemporary terms. Actually, the truth of who you are is already guaranteed. I'm just right now working on a little commentary on Paul's letter to the Colossians in the New Testament, and one of my favorite verses there is when he says, sort of very bizarrely, to his Christian readers, you died and your life is now hidden with Christ in God. When Christ, who is your life, appears, you also will appear with him in glory. A sort of extraordinary claim that like if you're a Christian, you're actually already dead. So like stop fixating on all the things and recognize instead that you're at the same time already dead and at the same time profoundly alive, and that your life is actually in the safest place in all the universe, which is with Christ, who is seated at God's right hand right now and who will return one day to make all things new and right. And just having that sort of that compass or that roadmap of life, regardless of how our individual lives sort of pan out in particular ways, is something that I think we, if we're Christians, can lean into it, and if we're parents, that we can point our kids to.
Yeah, I think along those lines, one of the really helpful lessons that I've learned as a mom is that the best way to disciple my kids is to be a disciple myself. Because if our kids don't have a vision for what you said, like that, the freedom of our identity, that we have died to ourselves and that we have been raised with Christ and that we actually can live freely and joyfully with him. If our children are seeing that in us, again, I do think that's very attractive to them. Not that we can, again, change their hearts ourselves, but I do think as moms or, as parents generally, we have an opportunity to cast a vision for what we're living for that's really better than what their peers are living for. And I think that's going to be really the most effective way for our kids to grow in their faith, is just to see that our faith is real and that it changes how we make our decisions. And it also changes how we parent, because now all of our energy in parenting is not necessarily towards them, but all of our energy in what we do, regardless of our life circumstance, of our work or our school, is directed towards the furthering of the kingdom. And our kids just get to join in with us in that.
Yeah, I think that's super important. I remember when my daughter was going through a lot of hard stuff at school, of friends just kind of ditching her because of her Christian beliefs. I wasn't able to say, oh, don't worry, this is just a phase and, this won't happen to you as you go on in life. I was able to say, I really get it. And like, this has actually happened to me, as much as an adult as it did as a child, just the places where actually to follow Jesus was so in conflict with what friends who I deeply loved believed and thought was right, that actually, I have had situations of friends just kind of walking, like saying, I really can't continue in close friendship with you, because of this. And that's hard when you're 13, and it's also hard when you're 43. Like it's actually kind of an ongoing life situation. I'm curious. So I had an idea the other day, which I don't think I floated to you, Julie. So I'm going to float it to you now and get your real-time feedback.
Great.
But I have been reading Jonathan Haidt's new book, The Anxious Generation, which I think you haven't yet read, but you've listened to a couple of his podcasts. Is that right?
Correct. Yep.
Talking about some of the ideas. So for those not familiar with Jonathan Haidt, he is a social psychologist based at NYU. He's sort of culturally Jewish, but convictionally atheist or agnostic, I think, in terms of what he believes. And he's written a really interesting book on the rising generation. So as Americans say Gen Z, and in England it's Gen Z, let it be known. And his basic hypothesis is that kids have been massively overprotected in the real world and massively underprotected online. That whereas kids haven't had the freedoms that their parents most likely had, to sort of walk a mile to school or, play, like ride around the neighborhood on their bikes without a parent sort of supervising or whatever, at a relatively young age. They've instead been given a smartphone from an early age and given basic, very minimal, if any, supervision as they've engaged with, websites that could be showing them all sorts of horrific things, or with social media, which may or may not be showing them horrific things, but has been doing horrific things to their psychology, especially I think for adolescent girls, of it really being pretty strongly correlated with some depression and anxiety and various other things. And one of the things that Jonathan Haidt talks about in his book is the idea that kids are what he calls anti-fragile. I think he got the word from somebody else, so I'm not only crediting him with it. But the basic idea is, we kind of know if you knock over a glass, as I did this morning while I was reading my Bible, I knocked over my glass of orange juice and it smashed onto the floor, and suddenly I was sort of sweeping up glass. Glass is fragile. If I had knocked over a plastic glass, it would have just bounced off the floor. It would be fine. Plastic is unfragile. But Jonathan Haidt is also talking about this concept of things being anti-fragile, as in kind of needing to be bashed around a bit in order to develop, in order to sort of gain strength in the ways that they need to gain strength. And he gives an example of a tree which was being grown, or some trees that were being grown in some sort of massive ecological bubble where the idea was that it would be kind of self-contained ecosystem, and they wouldn't, the animals and trees and even people in this massive bubble would have no interactions with the outside world and sort of see what happens. And one of the problems that arose was these trees would grow and then they'd fall over, because actually it turns out the young tree needed the winds to sort of knock them around a bit to make sure that they had the strength to stand up as adults. And so Jonathan Haidt is sort of very clear that kids need experiences where they, I don't know, fall out of a tree and hurt themselves and it's okay, or they get lost going somewhere and they figure it out, or they get left out at school, or they get, picked on, or whatever it is, that they have experiences that we as parents might instinctively want to protect them from, actually, but that if we only protect our kids from things, then we're actually not giving them the opportunity to grow in anti-fragility and the sort of strengths that they need. And the thing that I'm curious to hear your thoughts on is, I've been sort of pondering whether this applies also for those of us who are raising kids in Christian homes, whether actually the experience of encountering people and ideas who don't align with their Christian faith, whether it's going to a school where most people aren't Christians, or whether it's reading books that aren't necessarily sort of advocating for Christian perspectives on things, actually, rather than just protecting our kids from those things, that allowing our kids to have those experiences may actually help them grow in the resilience of their faith. Give me your first thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think I probably align with you pretty strongly on this. Again, that desire to protect our kids is just so strong. And I think as parents, we would do well to reflect upon our own upbringing, or even just the challenging life circumstances that we have encountered and how those have shaped us. Because I think we probably could all point to really difficult or challenging times that we've had that have helped us grow. So we sort of know this intellectually, that challenges help us grow, but we don't want our kids to face those. And again, I think as a Christian parent, this is where surrendering to the sovereignty of God for me is really like a lifeline, because I wouldn't sleep at night if I sat up wondering and worrying about all the things that could happen to my kids, all the things they could encounter, all of the dangerous or harmful circumstances that they could encounter in their lives. And so I think that kids are actually a lot more resilient than we give them credit for. And it's empowering to them to experience that. My 10-year-old was begging to walk home from school. It's like 2 miles home from school. And I had resisted for a while because she has to cross some major roads and it's fairly far. And I'm already there picking up her sisters. But finally I was like, all right, Marie, yeah, you can do it. And I mean, she just came bursting into the door and her face was red and she was lit up because she had done this thing that she could tell I thought was hard and maybe even beyond her capacities. And she had felt empowered by it. And I do think that allowing our kids to do things that are, within reason, but like somewhat risky, or putting our kids in situations like maybe in public schools where they're going to encounter ideas that are contrary to their faith, can actually be so good for them. Because as parents, we still foundationally, we're not just like putting them in these situations in isolation and not also helping them process through them. And I'm sure, you can relate to this. And for me, I think that's been so helpful, is that my 6th grader has come home and has wanted to stay up late at night talking with me about some of the things that she heard at school that are contrary to the things that we talk about as foundational to our faith. And I don't want to protect my kids from those in the sense that I don't want them to be shocked by the fact that there's a lot in the world that we don't align with as believers, but rather that she could experience that. And then I can trust that God is going to do whatever he's going to do in her heart to help her grow in that area, to see, why we believe what we believe, and how, who we are and what we stand for actually makes a lot of sense and is good and reasonable relative to some of, the narratives that are out there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that's super helpful. I think last thing that I would love for us to process, Julie, is the biblical idea of being a mother to people who you may not biologically be their mother. So I think we have a strong theme in the New Testament scriptures of the church as a family, and how within the church we relate to one another. All of us relate to one another at a basic level as brothers and sisters, but that even within that, if we think about people who are older relating with people who are younger, that there is a sort of mothering or fathering role that's appropriate to older Christians in relationship with younger Christians, and that's something that is important. I guess as I've thought about that in my own life, it's important to me in two domains. One is it's important for me that my kids experience the input and love and relationship with adult Christians who are not me or Brian. I think of our mutual friend Rachel, who listeners who heard last week's episode would have been introduced to Rachel there, who's been incredibly influential in my eldest daughter Miranda's life, and sort of got her up and running, reading the Bible for herself, got her learning the Bible, like the biblical languages for herself, in ways that I frankly would never have occurred to me to start, my 12-year-old on Greek and Hebrew. Has been incredibly influential for her. Or thinking of another single friend in our community group who was the first adult to take Miranda seriously, not just as a kid, and invited her out to dinner. In fact, they went to dinner again last night. They sort of have a fairly regular practice of just going out to dinner together, trying out new restaurants. And it was so formative for Miranda that Janice just, didn't treat her like a little kid, and actually helped her to think through, I could be having meaningful relationships with adults in our church community in ways that, are different from how I would have related to them when I was, 5 or 7 or even 10. And I think for me, as I get older, I've reached the glorious age of 44. My kids always laugh because whatever age I say I am, I always tell them it's an excellent age. And so far, all my ages have been excellent. So we'll see. I think one of the things that I have most enjoyed about being in my 40s is the opportunity to just naturally be in a parent adjacent role with some of the members of our church community who are in their 20s and even 30s, of sort of being the person who can give them a big hug, tell them hard truths, feed them when they need, like just the sort of things that come with that parental role. It's been really precious to me, and I think from what I've heard from others, sort of helpful to them to have people in their life who are playing that role. So I'd love to hear your thoughts, Julie, on what it means to be not only a mother to your own children, but to think about the role that you can play in the broader church as a slightly older woman. Fun fact, when Julie and I first met, I thought, I like Julie so much, but she's way too young to be like actually a close friend of mine, because you're are you 6 years younger than me? Something like that?
37. So 7, I guess.
7. Okay. 7 years. Oh gosh. I thought it was only 6. Maybe we can't be friends after all. Yeah. Just as you are now in your late 30s, what do you see as the kind of opportunities that you have to extend mothering beyond the 4 very lucky children who call you mum?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think your point is really salient kind of on both of those. The opportunities for my kids to be sort of mothered by other sisters in Christ in our congregation. I feel like there are many adults who can say something to my kids in a way that they will be able to hear that I cannot say to them in that same way, just because I'm their biological mother. And I think as they get older and as spiritually they are developing, they're going to have questions, and they've got a whole wealth of wise, thoughtful women in our church who are able to speak into those questions. So we were talking the other day about how, the voice of the parent maybe doesn't necessarily get quieter, but there's more of a chorus around the parent as around the child as the child is growing and able to hear some important truths that maybe depending on the relationship with their parent, there might not be kind of the willingness to listen as they get older. And then I think for me personally, that's something that I've always loved about the family of God. I genuinely feel like my friends' kids are my kids just in some very small way. I feel a surge of affection for their kids when they come down and when we're teaching them in the elementary Bible time. And I do think particularly because as parents, we know how exhausting parenting is. We have a role to like step in. There are lots of new moms with toddlers. I don't have any toddlers anymore. And so I have a little bit of energy to run around with their toddlers that they might not actually have. And then again, I think with regard to other women in the church, it's been really fun this year to be able to invest just a little bit more in some of those discipleship relationships with slightly younger women in our church. As my kids are in school and I've had a little bit more free time, it's just been so encouraging and fruitful to meet with young single women, young married women, young women who are expecting their first child, and just to be able to share life together and to hopefully, give them some kind of wisdom that I've learned in the last 12 years of parenting. But I think there's just so much joy in that. And I can think of many people throughout my sort of 20s and 30s that also took me under their wing and shared their wisdom with me. So I do think it's a great joy to be able to do that, particularly in the local family of God, where people are seeing us and loving our kids and we are loving their kids in return. And it just, it's really very beautiful.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think one of the biggest misconceptions that people often have about what the Christian life looks like is that their understanding of family is limited to the nuclear family in a way that the Bible's understanding of family just isn't. And that, which is not to denigrate the nuclear family for a minute, but actually to say, no, the nuclear family belongs in the family of the church. And single believers belong in the family of the church and are actually vital to that family in ways that when we sort of see the nuclear family as the be all end all, I think that can really get lost. I sometimes say to my kids, I tell them I would be equally proud of you if you grow up and get married and have children and, follow Jesus as a wife and mother and one day grandmother. And I will be equally proud of you if you grow up and serve the Lord as a single person and invest in spiritual children, and that is the calling that the Lord has for you. I like both of those things will delight me. And the one thing, or one of the things that I cannot model for my kids is how to live as a thriving single adult believer. And it's really precious to me that my kids get to see that modeled by a number of people in our kind of wider community, where they get to see, what does it look like to be a single Christian in your 20s, to be a single Christian in your 30s, to be a single Christian in your 40s, etc. That they can sort of see all the different good ways it can look to be a follower of Jesus and to be part of the family of God. And I hope that that's something that they will take with them into adulthood. That I think sometimes we get so fixated on the specifics of our individual lives that we can lose the joy of the broader family, and that's to the detriment of all of us, including, for example, a mother with infants or toddlers who, often mothers can feel desperately lonely being at home with a small child and not having a kind of broader family support because we've lost that sense of church as family and the kind of practical, tangible ways in which that can play out. Well, thank you, Julie, for chatting with me. Thank you for being my sister in Christ. Thank you for being a continual inspiration and encouragement to me in terms of what it looks like to be a godly mother who lives for Jesus and with her children, rather than just living for her children. It's a beautiful thing to witness and to be encouraged by day to day. When this episode goes out, the Americans will have just celebrated Mother's Day. And I looked up, apparently the Australians and New Zealanders will also have just celebrated Mother's Day, whereas we Brits celebrated Mother's Day in the middle of Lent. Let it be known, it's a whole different time. But regardless of how you felt this Mother's Day, I hope that this episode has been an encouragement to you or something that's provoked thought. You guys have been listening to the Confronting Christianity podcast. You can find me on Twitter or Instagram and the Confronting Christianity podcast in those places. Julie is wisely far away from Twitter, I believe. You can also leave a review on iTunes and maybe note a question there that you'd like to see explored in a future episode. And thank you for listening.